Hello, in this video I'll be reviewing I think the 15th book in the Dirk Pitt sort of series slash universe, Sahara. So let's just do it quick and spoiler free to begin with, and then we'll get into some meaty spoilers. So this is actually a good book, which might be a bit surprising to you if you watch my reviews of the other early Dirk Pitt books, which I didn't really enjoy that much. But this book is actually good. There's a lot of action, it's very fast paced, but it also feels like there's kind of a plotting intrigue behind the action at the same time, so it doesn't feel pointless, and it does feel like you're going somewhere and you're learning something about the world and about the plot. At the same time as we're just fast-paced, fun, interesting action, cool, dynamic villains that are not just moustache twirling necessarily, they actually have things that they're trying to achieve. And they're kind of based on sort of real-world sort of villains that we actually have in the world. And so that makes it even more satisfying when now we're getting into spoilers, they get their comeuppance. So yeah, fantastic book, and I would recommend it. So yeah, let's get into some of those meaty spoilers. So this book basically follows, the very, very basic plot of this book is there's this sort of waste disposal plant in Mali that is supposed to be just destroying everybody's waste. But as it turns out, they're not really destroying everybody's waste because they are taking on way more waste than they can destroy, and they're just storing it underground. And unfortunately, this waste is getting into this underground river system, getting into the Niger River, and basically poisoning the entire ocean, and everybody's going to die. Because the ocean's going to get poisoned and the world's going to run out of oxygen. And so our main characters have to take a trip up the river, find where, on a nice fancy boat, find where the pollution is starting, and trace it to its source, and then stop it. But of course, along the way, they run into a whole bunch of sort of various hijinks that prevent them from doing this very easily. So let's kind of take it point by point. So the first, or kind of part by part of the book. So the first part of the book is, we have a prologue, which shows the US, or I guess the CSS, Confederate States ship Texas, back in 1864, escaping Union lines. Now, this part on its own actually functions very well. It is just a nice action sort of set piece. We get just enough to know what's going on, to be interested, but not in, and we're kind of, so we're mostly interested in this not because of the characters, but because we're kind of curious as to what's happening. We're like, well, why are we being... First of all, the first question is, why are we being told about this? That's always interesting in a book, kind of a Chekhov's gun question. It's like, well, if you're showing me this, why are you showing me this? So there's that question, and you try to figure out, what's going on. And of course, you come to a conclusion that you've figured out what's going on, and you're like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? And of course, what's going on is that Abraham Lincoln is on the ship, and you're like, wow, that's crazy. So that first part functions quite well on its own. However, and this will get into an issue I discuss a bit later, it functions very poorly as part of a story, in the sense that it doesn't actually end up being that related to the story at all, really. So that's the first prologue. Then we have a second prologue. So we've got two prologues in this book. And the second one is a Australian pilot. She's flying over Sahara. Her plane crashes, and she tries to survive for a bit and ends up dying. Now, this actually functions extremely well in the exact same way that the first part functions well, in the sense that it's fun, interesting action, and we also have that mystery of why are we being shown this? Like, what's going on? Like, what is the purpose of this? But I will say that this has the slight advantage in the sense that it actually does end up being pretty relevant later in the story. You could very easily have gone without this prologue, I think, and been fine. But I do think that, it was interesting enough in its own, and it was relevant enough to the story that I'm fine with this prologue. So that's kind of the first two sections covered. Then I guess I would say the next sort of section, obviously it's a bit less well defined, but I'd say the next sort of section is when we start with Dirk Pitt saving our main female character. He saves her from being killed on a beach, and then, wines and dines her, and then is hanging out finding like historical ships in the Nile, or next to the Nile, because the Nile's moved. And so this, I think, functions really well as kind of an intro to... first of all, we get a nice little bit of action at the very start where he saves this woman from people trying to kill her, and it gives us kind of that first introduction to this mystery what's going on. Oh, my God, I'm so sorry. I actually forgot the third prologue to this book. It has 3 prologues, which is this guy, he's out, in the desert with a tour guide. He's a tour guide, and he's, showing people about, the desert. And they come on this, like, sort of semi-abandoned town, and so the people are, just kind of chilling in the well in the town, getting nice and wet. They've been in the desert. And then they get attacked by these sort of, like, monstrous, like, sort of semi-rabid kind of people. Think zombies, but not really, and... they get attacked, and this one guy gets away. And definitely this functions really, really well. It's a fantastic action scene, and, really well written, lots of suspense, and then definitely, like, fully strongly relates to the rest of the story. So I think this was really good. And it was also giving us a lot of it kind of introduces our villains, because our sinister villains put the one guy who escapes, they put him into like some mine so he can't talk about what he's seen. So you're definitely like, oh, these are bad guys, and not only are we showing that they're bad guys, but we're showing that they are perhaps ruthless in a good way, and not in a good way as in they're good people, but ruthless in an effective way. So yeah, those are our 3 prologues. And then, yeah, getting into that scene so back to where we were before, where Pitt is, our main character is, he saves this woman, so that's a good action scene, and then we get to see, kind of a slight lull in the action, because we basically had 3 action prologues, and then Pitt saving this woman, so 4 kind of action scenes really in a row, and then we take this sort of lull where he takes her on a date, and they talk about the situation and what's happening, which kind of, it's a little bit exposition-y, but I didn't feel it was too painful, really, to be honest, and I definitely think it was nice to kind of take that slight lull down in the action. And then once again, that lull continues for a little while, where Dirk Pitt's just sort of hanging out in the Nile, they're finding old ships and stuff, and this is not a very long section. And then that, I guess, this part of the book, I would say, kind of ends when Dirk Pitt gets taken, away to go to the main quest, so to speak, by Rudy Gunn showing up and being like, oh, we need to go. So this part of the book, I think, functions extremely well. Once again, I actually really think that, so far so good, so to speak, in the sense that, we're really getting into the action. We've had some exposition, we've had some action, and it's, it's good vibes. So then, the next part of our book is Dirk Pitt and Al Giardino and Rudy Gunn going up the river. And we're given, trying to find this, source of a pollution. And then I guess this sort of section I'd say ends when they find the pollution. And I definitely think that this part of the book is really good as well. And you kind of sound like a bit of a broken record here, but all of this stuff is actually very well done. I think the action is, for example, they, as I sail through Benin, the Benin Navy tries to apprehend them, try and take over their boat, and they just, blow them all out of the sky / the water. And it's just really well done, really fun action. And then the next part of the book is Dirk and Al Giardino get captured and then escape. And then Rudy Gunn also manages to... but Dirk and Al Giardino escape into Mali, whereas Rudy Gunn manages to escape out of Mali and, go back to Washington to inform his superiors what's going on. And this is really good. Like, this is actually really great stuff. We get to see our main characters meet the villains. And, first of all, we get the main characters sort of spiting the villains, talking a bit of shit, but then they get captured. But then they do manage to escape. And so I think this is really, really cool. And like I say, the villains in this book are really good and really intimidating and really ruthless and mostly quite smart. You know what I mean? So I really think that it's fun to see them do their thing. So we go from that to so Dirk Pitt and Al Giardino have escaped, and so they try to trace down the source of the pollution, and they eventually find it at this this dude's processing facility that we talked about at the start, where he's not actually processing everything that he was supposed to, all the pollutants that he was supposed to. So we go, they're trying to get in there and they get captured again, and then so that's kind of where the next part of the book starts, where they get captured, they get sent to this mine, where, all these prisoners are being kept, they escape the mine, and they come back with a bunch of, sort of special forces to take back the mine, to get the prisoners out of a mine. But unfortunately the special forces plane gets destroyed, and so they have to sort of, travel across Mali to try and escape. And this is absolutely fantastic. It's really satisfying seeing the villains in this mine, who've been abusing all these slaves, get their comeuppance. There's really great action here, and it's kind of a sort of satisfying type of action where the villain, it's that side of a story where the villains are starting to get overrun and starting to get their comeuppance, and it's just fun to see our main characters be competent and effective and get their revenge, and it's really well done. And then, so we go from that scene to him escaping across, and then we have, I think, perhaps the best scene that Clive Cussler's ever written, that I'm aware of, and one of a fantastic action scene where they basically, the special forces that rescued these prisoners, they're holed up in this fort, and then the Malian forces discover that they're in this fort and attack the fort. And it's just a fantastically written, beautiful last stand sort of scene, they're fighting to the death, trying to protect these civilians and themselves from the Malian special force, from the Malian army. There's 1,500 Malian soldiers there trying to take them out, and they're fighting a desperate battle to save themselves. And it's beautifully written, fantastic action, almost a tiny bit emotional. I'm like, is this really a Dirk Pitt novel? And I'm getting a tiny bit emotional. It's really well done, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And then finally, we go from there to, and at that battle, the general, one of our villains, dies. And then they go and eventually talk to the French guy, force him to drink the French villain, force him to drink his own sort of polluted water, and then he dies. And then the book kind of ends with Mr. Dirk Pitt meeting back up with his female lead, and them going to go look for the sort of buried treasure of this French guy. So, if we analyze the book in that way, just section by section, how does each section function, you can tell that I'm very, very positive on it, because I think section by section, everything is just really well done. Oh, I forgot the final bit where They go back and they find the Texas, the USS Texas, that ship that escaped in the first prologue. They find it under the desert sand, and they're like, oh, cool, turns out Abraham Lincoln was here. So, and that section does not function well. We'll get to that in a sec. But, so if we take it section by section, other than that last bit, every single part of a book just functions exactly how it's supposed to be. Fast-paced action. I mean, you can tell from that summary, there's just a lot of stuff going on in this book. So fast-paced action, slight bit of intrigue, figuring out what's going on, but just really, really well done, section by section, beautiful. But if we kind of drill down into a little bit into the specifics, there's a couple of sort of flaws. So first of all, the premise as a whole is very flawed. As in, even if all life in the ocean died right now, there would still be enough oxygen for, a long time. There would be massive ecosystem collapse and, like, all sorts of issues. But in the short term, they're talking about how the oxygen will run out in, like, 8 months, which is absolutely not even close to being true. There'd be, many centuries of oxygen just in the atmosphere. But obviously we'd have much greater issues because, massive ecosystem collapse. But yeah, so the first of all, the premise is a bit flawed. And second of all, this thing with the USS Texas with Abraham Lincoln being on it just feels like some random sort of conspiracy theory kind of thing, which is randomly shoved in there for no real purpose. So we had this whole prologue, and it's like, oh yeah, it turns out the USS Texas ironclad was there, and then at the end, they're like, oh my gosh, it was there, what a shock. And you're kind of like, what was the point of this? It doesn't interact with the main story at all. In no way is it related to the main story of the book. It's just this weird sort of side quest. It doesn't add anything at all, and it was just a bit painful. So that is sort of a big negative. And there's, I guess, a little bit of kind of subtle sexism in this book, where the female character is always just having to be rescued and never really does anything of use because she's a female. But I must say that the sexism here is a much more subtle and easy to ignore than it is in some of those earlier books where it's just extremely overt. So it's kind of like, look, if if sexism bothers you, then, maybe don't read it. But if you can kind of look past a bit of subtle sexism to enjoy a great story, then it's not so bad. But yeah, so this is a much more positive review. I would really actually recommend this book. Like I said, fast-paced, great quality action, only some slight flaws, including like a random unnecessary side plot and some like sort of subtle sexism. But other than that, I think it's a really fantastic book, and I hope you pick it up and enjoy it.